Hello everyone, today I'm going to be doing a no-nonsense guide on how to review your previous sessions, not only to study your game and improve your leaks, but also as a way to warm up before you play your session for the day. This is something that I have done every single time before I've played a session for my entire poker career, and I think it is one of the main reasons why I've had a lot of success. Not only does it allow me to fix my leaks and try to solve bad habits before they really start to show up consistently in my game, but it also allows me to warm up so that as soon as I get onto the tables, I'm playing my A game, which is exactly what we want to be doing. So getting right into it, in order to review a previous session, you obviously have to remember what day you played your last session. I played my last session yesterday, so I would just go to the date tab and I would go to yesterday. It'll pull up my last session. As we can see, it was a losing session. I lost about 2 buy-ins. And my ceiling adjusted was even worse, about 3 buy-ins down. And just looking at the graph to try to kind of see what went wrong, the red line was very much down, so there's a very good chance that I was not being aggressive enough in trying to take pots away. So that's something I'll keep in mind as I go through the actual hands. If you want to find your session that you played on the previous days, you can always go to select date and you can choose the exact date that your session was on so that you can easily find your hands. So going back to my yesterday session, because I'm currently in the graphs section on Poker Tracker, I'm going over to the results. So here we are now in results, and you can do this as well in Hold'em Manager 3, Poker Tracker 4. Any of these HUD softwares will work perfect for this. And the first thing I like to do is I like to go to the stake I lost money in. So I ended up playing 1,000 hands, losing about 2.25 buy-ins, 2 1/3 buy-ins at NL100. So I like to review the hands that I lost the most money on. I will review every single hand that I lost I lost more than 10 big blinds, and I'll review every single hand that I won more than about 15 big blinds. This entire process takes usually around 30 minutes, depending on how much you played the day before. I'm not going to go through the entire breakdown today, but we'll go over at least a few hands so you guys kind of see what I'm saying. So after we have this, we want to make sure that that this bar over here says all hands. It usually will say your most recent 100 hands, but as you probably played a session that you played way more than 100 hands, you need to go all hands so we can see all of the hands that we played. So I've actually already reviewed this session, but I'm making this video so I can at least already have some idea of some of the hands that I've played. So we're going to go to this one tab and just left clicking it so it will show until it shows you the amounts or the biggest pots that you've lost. So this is sorting by the biggest pots that I've lost down. So you can see I've lost a lot of pots here, 50 big blind pot. We like to see what's going on. And when I actually go into the hand, I would just like to go through it. Some of these spots are obviously going to be coolers, and you can quickly go through those ones. But I would think very hard and honestly, especially when you're losing around 20 to 50 big blinds, was there an opportunity for me to take the pot away? Did a more aggressive line, or would a more aggressive line yield better results? Or perhaps my line was too aggressive and I needed to slow down or check in some spots. Or maybe I missed some value, which is something that we'll talk about once we get to the winning hands. But here, who knows? Usually when you lose 50 big blinds, you usually do something pretty wrong. So we'll see what I do. So this fish raises. So I think this is probably a slam dunk call, especially someone who doesn't fold very often to c-bets. We only have a few hands on this opponent, so we can't draw too many conclusions from our HUD. Another important mistake not to make is to not try drawing like concrete conclusions from your HUD, especially when you have very few hands on opponents. But with a VPIP and PFR stats like this, after 30 hands, we can pretty much safely conclude this player's a fish. So I think calling is the best option. I think 3-betting is going to lead me into too many strange situations, and just calling a position is completely fine. That's what I do. So that's good. So that is kind of exactly the thought process. You want to have a hypothesis for every single action you make. That's the most important philosophy behind reviewing your hands and playing poker in general. I'll have a whole other video about having a hypothesis at some point, but just make sure that you want to have a reason of why you make an action based on general ABC poker knowledge, game theory, or exploitative strategy. And, against fish, it's all about exploitative strategy. And fish don't tend to fold very often post flop. So if I did raise with a hand like 10 Jack, which would be a slam dunk 3-bet against a lot of regulars, we're not going to have the same fold equity as we would against those regulars, because these kind of players are going to probably call a 3-bet more often than regulars, so we don't have any fold equity before the flop. And then after the flop, we're not going to have very much fold equity either. And 10 Jack is not a hand that we want to be shoveling money in before the flop. We want to be making a strong hand and then putting money in. So I call, folds around, and we flop a overpair, or we flop a 2 overcards with a gut shot and the flush draw. So this is one of the better flops for us for sure. A 9 is super good, any spade is super good, and we have a and we just have 2 overcards as well. So this player c-bets pretty frequently, it seems. I can go to the flop tab to see how often they bet. So it seems like she doesn't bet too often on the flop, but she usually fires a c-bet, and Annie does right here. And so my next hypothesis is, so I probably can just call this bet, because I usually don't like to raise fish until I've made my hand. I don't really like semi-bluffing as much, because they just don't tend to fold, and part of the appeal of semi-bluffing is you can get your opponents to fold, and that kind of frees up, and that kind of makes you take in a lot of equity right away. But with a combo draw, when you have like more than 50% equity, most likely, I don't hate bluffing or semi-bluffing here with a raise, just because this player seems to bet kind of frequently too, and she might just have to let it go if she just has a couple of overcards, and that's definitely a win for us. So we also can launch an equity calculator to kind of test this hypothesis. So like, how well are we doing against pocket aces or an overpair? So against pocket aces on the flop, we are about 42%, which is pretty good. And against a more mild hand like ace queen, we'll give him a spade. Why not? Then, or not ace of spades, queen of spades. That one's not going to look pretty for us. Ace of spades, queen of hearts. We are actually a pretty big favorite. And against a single pair hand, I think we're going to have pretty much the same equity. So let's say ace 8. We are going to have more than 50% equity. So I don't think this raising here is a terrible option. I don't think calling is a terrible option. Now that I think about it, and this player seems to be c-betting fairly frequently, again, we only have 3 hands. It's really kind of hard to draw any conclusions. We definitely could be raising here, and that's completely fine. So again, I had a hypothesis. I thought about it, tried to make sure it makes sense, and I think raising here is probably the best option, because we might just win the pot right now, and if we do make a hand, like if we do hit a 9 or a flush, we probably can win a bigger pot, and the only way we can win a bigger pot is if we inflate the pot right now. So I think raising is probably the slightly better option at this point, which is what I end up doing. Make it about 3x. You probably could go a little bit smaller here, like 2.5x. But it doesn't hurt to bet a little bit bigger in these kinds of games against fish. I'd rather bet bigger if I had a made hand, but I probably could have put this bet sizing a little bit lower, but nothing too crazy. Annie makes the call, and I think she's not going to be doing this with absolutely nothing. I'm pretty sure she's going to have a pair, a draw, or I mean, those are the only 2 things she can have at this point. So the turn comes the 10 of clubs, which is not a terrible card for us. It allows us to beat all of the single pair hands like king 8 or ace 8 or ace 7, ace 5, all those hands that might have been sticky and called on the flop. And we'll see what Annie does. Annie checks to us, as people usually do after getting raised. And I think at this point, I just want to check back. I think we have good equity to see a showdown. The fact that Annie called definitely means she could have some 2 pairs and some overpairs in her range. She might even have a hand like She might even have a hand like pocket fives, pocket sevens, pocket eights. So we definitely don't really see the point of inflating the pot any further. If we hit our flush or straight on the river, we can make a pot size bet and still get a lot of value. But hitting this 10 and giving us a pretty solid piece of equity makes me think I usually just want to be checking here on the turn. And I don't. So I definitely think I made a mistake here. And I feel like this is going to pretty much... It's kind of like a way ahead, way behind situation. It's going to allow my opponent to pretty much throw away all of her junk. I don't think she's going to continue with a smaller pair at this point. She probably might continue with like a hand like ace-8. And now she's probably going to continue with only hands that are a decent amount ahead of me. And I only have one card left to come to hit my draws, which isn't terrible. It's not like I don't have any equity in this pot, but if we get raised here, things can go pretty south pretty quickly. Although I don't really expect her to raise very often, but she does end up making the raise. And now I'm starting to think this opponent has a set or a straight. Maybe 8-7, but she almost certainly has a set or a straight. But we're getting good enough odds, 22%, to hit a 9 or a flush draw. So I definitely think we should just go ahead and call. I mean, if we hit a flush or we hit a 9, we can probably stack this opponent. So, calling here. Hitting the king. Obviously, we completely miss. Our opponent shoves and we have to fold. So, I think we could have saved ourselves about 40 big blinds. Or $40, really, if we just didn't bet the turn. Alright, moving on to the next hand. Alright, moving on. So, I don't want to go through all of these hands because it's just going to take too much time, but hopefully you can kind of understand my philosophy is to just have a hypothesis and painstakingly go through the hand and make sure that every single time you made a decision, you had a reason why you made that decision, and make sure that, you know, if you do make a decision that you didn't think was correct, always make a note of it and try to see if there's any patterns in how you've been playing so that you can try to, you know, weed out all those leaks and bad habits. So the other thing is, if you're not sure what you should do, or you're not sure if your hypothesis is right or not, then you should be marking the hand. You can tag it either as review. As you see, I tagged hands here that I wasn't exactly sure how I played. And you're going to have a lot of hands that you're going to tag, and that's completely okay. And they're mostly going to be losing hands. Because you probably didn't play a losing hand well, although you probably played a winning hand well. Not necessarily true, but it's how it is. And it's it's a great thing to go through these hands and compile spots that you weren't sure about, and then talking it over either with a coach or with a friend, somebody you trust and has good poker advice. Hopefully somebody who's better than you, which is usually why it's nice to have a coach, and see what they think about these spots, see their hypotheses, and compare that with your own thought process. And this is exactly how we want to be improving. This is exactly how we want to get in the right poker mindset before we start playing for the day. And you might not go into exactly as great of detail I went in with this hand, because we have a lot of hands to go through. Like, I had probably like 20 hands to review. As I did this last night because I was frustrated that I lost this session, so I wanted to review it right away. But now we're going to look at some of the winning hands and see if we could have made any more money. So usually what we look at when we look at winning hands, we're not looking at them just to pat ourselves on the shoulder and, you know, be like, oh, we're great, good job, guys, we won a lot of money. We're there to make sure that we're making the most profitable lines and we're making the most money. So I remember this hand very well. We have this kind of donkey aggro fish thingy. He's not quite a maniac, but he's definitely an aggro fish. Raising from middle position, the first thing we should do is you should check how often this opponent raises from middle position. Oh, it looks like they raise 40% of the time. So that's a pretty wide range. And so this person folds, and now we're on the button against a 40% range in position with a hand like Queen King suited. I definitely think we want to be sticking in a 3-bet here. Calling means we might get squeezed from this aggressive opponent, which is not really a great option for us. Although calling does make it a little bit easier for this big whale to come along as well. But I think ultimately we just want to play a 3-bet pot here just because we're so far ahead of his range. We can do a quick analysis to confirm that, because the suited kings, you'd be surprised, you're not usually that far ahead. So we'll launch our equity calculator, and we can go to the select thing, and we'll see how far we're ahead of a 40% range. I imagine we're only like 56, 57% ahead. Maybe closer to 60. We'll see. Probably around 56, 57. We'll see what happens. Maybe I'm wrong, and this is why we do these things. Yep, so we're about 55% ahead of this range. So we don't have a ginormous range advantage versus opponent. However, we are in position, which means it's easier for us to play the hand, easier for us to extract value. And King Queen suited is a pretty easy hand to play. It's always a good thing to have hands with a lot high playability. So let's see what I do. I think I end up just calling. I don't really agree with that. I think 3-betting is the best option. Although this fish does come along, which is one of the pros of calling. So we flop two overcards with a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. So this is another great candidate to be bluff raising. So we'll see what happens. He checks. Then this fish decides to bet. He bets 90% of the time. I have 600 hands on him, so I have a significant enough sample size that I am certainly going to be looking for big exploits here. He c-bets the flop 90% of the time, and he c-bets the turn 50% of the time. So this person has a very large gap between his flop bet and turn bet. So this usually means that floating is the best option. We can see how often he folds to a float bet. And by the way, you can find these HUD stats or this HUD profile in my Discord under the HUD profiles. This is the full version. I think it's the most helpful for my stakes. But he doesn't usually fold to a float bet. He's only folded to a float bet 1 in 6 times. So I don't think that floating is going to be the best option here. And we see that this person has folded to a raise 4 out of 5 times. So I think raising here is going to have the best results. It's going to push this guy out of the pot if he has a small pair. And it's going to, which is good for us. And it's going to probably force this guy to fold with all of his nonsense since he's pretty much auto c-betting every flop. So I do decide to raise here, which I think is definitely the best play. I'd raise 3x, I think, which I think is also fine in this situation. Just trying to extract some. You could probably make it 2.5x, but 3x, just trying to get the fold, is completely fine. And we still have plenty of poker left to play if he does call. We have a pretty good hand. So this guy ends up calling. And that's going to start ringing alarm bells immediately. So I'm thinking when somebody usually folds to an action, when somebody usually takes an action and they decide not to take it, this guy usually folds to a flop raise, and this time he didn't fold to a flop raise. This means his range is going to be a lot stronger than average, or a lot stronger than like game theory or a typical range would be. So I'm already putting him on, strong jacks, over pairs, and, possibly sets at this point. So the turn comes the 5 of diamonds, which is a nice card for us, giving us the out to the flush. And we're going to see what our fish does. He decides to check. And at this point, kind of like not trying to make the same mistake I made the previous hand, I think we should just check back here. And this really, especially since I think his range is really strong, this is not really a scary card. I don't think he's going to be folding very often. So it's usually best against these types of opponents to wait till you make your hand, then start betting big for value. So if I check and it comes a 10 or a diamond, I can definitely get some big value in here. So our opponent checks. I think I should check behind. Let's see what I end up doing. I check. Bink. Perfect river card. We only lose to one hand. I guess we lose to 6, 10, or 6, 7. No, 6, 7 of diamonds as well, if that hand somehow withstood a flop raise. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what our opponent does. Our opponent decides to lead into us for pot. And so now I'm starting to think the opponent would do this with a set. Opponent would do this with a straight. Opponent would do this with a flush. Now, hands like ace jack of diamonds would call me on the flop, but there's not too many ace x hands otherwise that would call me on the flop, so I'm not super concerned about the ace of diamonds. So I think we pretty much can raise, and we can raise huge. And when I mean raise huge against a fish that has a went to showdown value, only a went to showdown value of 28, he's folded to a river 2-bet 2 out of 3 times. So I don't think we can get away with just jamming it here. But he will have hands like maybe even like Jack 10 of diamonds. That could be a hand that we're ahead of. And so that's another flush. I guess he could have a hand like Queen 10 that called a raise and is now betting with his straight. But I'm not sure if he's even going to call a big jam on the river, especially with how deep stacked we are. I think we should raise to about 3.5x here. I think we should make it like $110. That way, I think it's pretty easy for him to call, and he doesn't have to commit his entire stack. Although it's not a terrible opportunity. Maybe some people will criticize me and say this is just jam spot. We'll see what happens with these deep stacks against a fishy opponent. I decided to make it only 60, only like 2.5x. I think this is probably could get away with betting like $30 more here. So I definitely think I missed some value. Our opponent does make the call with his straight, and I think he's had the diamond blocker too, so he probably felt pretty good about that. I don't really have too many flushes. This is like the only hand I think that makes sense to raise the flop with and have a flush here, so maybe he made a pretty good call. Probably has to with his straights, but possibly could have gotten at least a little bit more value. Probably another 30 big blinds worth of value, which goes a whole long way. So definitely think I could have played this hand a little bit better, even though I didn't. Even though I won 100 big blinds, could have probably won 130. So that's basically my go-to warm-up strategy and how I go through reviewing hands. I hope this was helpful. I hope this allows you guys to start doing this before your sessions. I think it's going to have a very, very big impact on your game and playing your A game right out of the gate and making the best decisions that we possibly can at the poker table. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you in my next video. Have a good one. Bye.